You're here to relax, and I'm here to guide you. Before we begin, take a deep breath. Let go of everything that happened today. This moment is just for you. In the calm of the night, or the stillness of the early morning, wherever you are, I'd love to know, which city are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? Leave a comment below. I read every single one, and it helps me feel closer to you, even across the distance. Now close your eyes if you'd like. Let's begin. The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital buzzed softly overhead as I made my way through the deserted corridor of the oncology wing. 3 years as a night shift nurse, and I still hadn't grown accustomed to the eerie stillness that descended upon the hospital after midnight. The daytime chaos of doctors, families, and administrative staff gave way to an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the occasional beeping of machines and the squeak of my white sneakers against the polished floor. My name is Emily Chen, and I'd chosen the night shift deliberately. The extra pay helped with my student loans, but more importantly, the relative quiet allowed me to provide more personalized care to my patients. Tonight was my third consecutive 12-hour shift, and exhaustion pulled at my eyelids as I checked the monitors of the sleeping patients in room 412. St. Catherine's was a sprawling medical complex on the outskirts of Boston, parts of it dating back to the 1920s. The older wings, with their narrow corridors and aging infrastructure, were gradually being renovated, but budget constraints meant that certain sections, like the one where I worked, maintained an unsettling, antiquated charm. The oncology department occupied the 4th floor of the East Wing, a section where the renovation had stalled indefinitely. Tonight was particularly quiet. We were understaffed, as usual. My colleague Daniela had called in sick, leaving just me and Mark, an older nurse who preferred to station himself at the central desk to cover the entire floor of 26 patients. Ordinarily, we would have at least 4 nurses on duty. Just the way hospital administration saves money, Mark had grumbled when I arrived for my shift. One of these nights something's gonna happen, and they'll finally realize you can't run a hospital ward on skeleton crews. His choice of words, skeleton crews, had sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. Adjacent to our oncology department was the old psychiatric wing, closed for renovation 2 years ago but never actually worked on. Budget cuts again. The wing had been sealed off with temporary drywall and plastic sheeting, the doorway marked with no entry signs. But the barrier did little to block the strange sounds that sometimes emanated from behind it. The settling of an old building, maintenance workers explained, or perhaps the HVAC system struggling against Boston's bitter winter. That night, the temperature had dropped to near freezing, unusual for early October. The heating system was working overtime, creating strange pressure differentials throughout the building. Doors would suddenly close by themselves, and drafts would whistle through the narrower corridors. Around 2 a.m., I was checking on Mrs. Abernathy, an elderly woman recovering from her 3rd round of chemotherapy. She'd been having trouble sleeping, so I'd promised to bring her some warm tea. As I adjusted her IV line, she gripped my wrist with surprising strength. "Someone was in here earlier," she whispered, her eyes wide. "A man standing in the corner, just watching." I glanced at the empty corner of the room, smiling gently. "Probably just Dr. Reynolds during rounds," I assured her, though I knew Reynolds had left hours ago. Hallucinations weren't uncommon in patients undergoing intense treatment regimens. "No," she insisted. "Not a doctor. He wasn't wearing a coat, just regular clothes, old clothes. And he was so pale." I checked her chart, no medications that would typically cause such vivid hallucinations. Still, I made a mental note to mention it to the doctor in the morning. "I'll get your tea," I said, patting her hand. "And I'll check back in 15 minutes. Try to rest, Mrs. Abernathy." As I headed to the small kitchenette at the end of the hall, I noticed how the temperature seemed to drop with each step. By the time I reached the kitchen, I could see my breath forming small clouds in front of my face. The heating must be malfunctioning again, I thought, making another mental note to call maintenance in the morning. That's when I first saw him, a figure at the end of the hallway, partially obscured in shadow. He stood motionless, facing the sealed entrance to the abandoned wing. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice echoing down the empty corridor. "Visiting hours are over. Are you looking for someone?" The figure didn't respond or turn around. He wore what appeared to be dark slacks and a faded button-up shirt, definitely not hospital attire. From this distance, all I could make out was his thin frame and slightly stooped posture. "Sir?" I called again, more firmly this time. When he still didn't acknowledge me, I began walking toward him, irritation mixing with concern. Sometimes family members of terminal patients would try to stay past visiting hours, desperate for every possible moment with their loved ones. While I sympathized, hospital rules existed for a reason. About halfway down the corridor, I reached for my phone to call security. That's when the figure finally turned, and I froze. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the dim corridor light. His skin was so pale it appeared translucent, the blue veins beneath clearly visible across his temples. But what struck me most was his expression, not surprise or guilt at being caught, but a profound sadness that seemed to emanate from him like a physical force. "You can't be here," I managed to say, my voice less authoritative than I'd intended. "I need to ask you to leave or I'll have to call security." He tilted his head slightly, examining me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I'm looking for Dr. Weiss," he said finally, his voice surprisingly clear and calm. "He has my results." Dr. Weiss? The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. He certainly wasn't on our current staff roster. "There's no Dr. Weiss on duty tonight," I explained. "The doctor's offices are closed until morning. Perhaps you could come back tomorrow?" The man shook his head slowly. "He told me to come tonight. Room 478. My results can't wait." He gestured toward the sealed entrance to the psychiatric wing. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the faulty heating. Room 478 would be in the abandoned wing, a wing that had been closed off for 2 years. "Sir, that section of the hospital has been closed for renovation," I said, taking an instinctive step backward. "There's no room 478 accessible right now. All patient care happens in this wing. Now, I really must insist you leave." His expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "He has my results," he repeated. "Stage 4, inoperable. But he said there might be a trial, a new treatment." My nurse's training kicked in, and I realized I was dealing with a confused patient. Possibly someone suffering from dementia or another cognitive impairment. I softened my approach. "What's your name, sir? Perhaps I can help you find the information you're looking for." "Robert Emerson," he replied without hesitation. "Admitted September 14th. I nodded, trying to appear calm while reaching for my phone again. "Let me just check your records, Mr. Emerson." After convincing Mr. Emerson to wait in the family consultation room, a small space with comfortable chairs and magazines, I hurried back to the nurse's station where Mark was dozing in front of the computer monitor. "Mark," I said, shaking his shoulder gently. "Wake up. I need your help." He startled awake, blinking rapidly. "What? What's happening? Code blue?" "No, nothing like that," I assured him. "There's a confused man in the consultation room. Says he's a patient looking for a Dr. Weiss in the old wing. Claims he was admitted recently." Mark frowned, fully alert now. "That wing's been closed forever, and I don't remember any Dr. Weiss." "Me neither, but the name sounds familiar. Can you check the records for a patient named Robert Emerson? I want to figure out if he's a current or former patient before I call security." Mark turned to the computer and began typing. After several minutes of searching, he shook his head. No Robert Emerson, currently admitted. Let me check past records. As he dug through the digital archives, I noticed a dusty filing cabinet in the corner of the office, the one containing paper records that predated our electronic system. Most of those files had been digitized, but some older ones remained in their original form. Nothing in the system going back 5 years, Mark reported. Let me check the old files, I said, already moving toward the cabinet. The bottom drawer contained records from the early 2000s, organized alphabetically. Under E, I found it. A thin file labeled Emerson Robert. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The admission date read September 14, 2003, exactly 22 years ago. The attending physician, Dr. Jonathan Weiss, oncology. The diagnosis, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The patient had been enrolled in an experimental treatment trial, but it was the last page of the file that made my blood run cold. A death certificate. Robert Emerson had died on October 9, 2003, tomorrow's date. Mark, I whispered, you need to see this. As he read over my shoulder, his face paled. This has got to be a different Robert Emerson, he said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. I need to go back and talk to him, I said, standing up. Something isn't right. Mark grabbed my wrist. Emily, wait, let's call security first. This guy could be dangerous. I hesitated, then nodded. Fine. You call security. I'll go make sure he stays put until they arrive. The consultation room was empty when I returned. Panic rising in my throat, I hurried down the corridor, checking each room along the way. No sign of Robert Emerson. Then I saw him, standing once again in front of the sealed entrance to the old wing, his hand pressed against the temporary wall, as if trying to feel something through it. Mr. Emerson, I called out, approaching cautiously. Security is on their way. I need you to come back to the consultation room with me. He turned to face me, that same profound sadness in his eyes. You found my file. It wasn't a question. Yes, I admitted. But there must be some mistake. That file is for someone who was a patient here over 20 years ago. A faint smile crossed his lips. No mistake. I died in room 478, but not before Dr. Weiss promised me something. My professional composure began to crumble. This isn't funny. You need to leave now. He promised I wouldn't suffer. Robert continued as if I hadn't spoken. But I did, for hours, alone. The experimental treatment went wrong. They couldn't control the pain. Dr. Weiss went home, and the night nurse. His gaze intensified. The night nurse ignored my call button, said I was just seeking attention. By morning, it was too late. Security still hadn't arrived. Mark must be having trouble reaching them. I backed away slowly, fumbling for my phone. Every year, I come back, Robert said, his voice now barely above a whisper. On the night before my death, looking for someone who will listen, someone who will correct the record. My back hit the wall. There was nowhere else to retreat. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice shaking. The truth, he said simply. In my file, they listed complications from treatment as my cause of death. Not negligence, not abandonment. I want the record corrected. I want the truth known. Against all rational thought, I found myself asking, how? How can I correct a 20-year-old record? The truth is still in room 478, he said. My journal. I documented everything. It's hidden behind the loose baseboard under the window. No one ever found it. As he spoke these words, the temperature in the corridor dropped dramatically. The lights flickered, and in that momentary darkness, I felt rather than saw him move closer to me. When the light stabilized, he was gone. Security arrived minutes later, finding me alone in the hallway, clutching Robert Emerson's file to my chest. They searched the entire floor, but found no sign of any unauthorized visitor. The camera footage from that corridor showed only me, appearing to have a conversation with empty space. The next morning, I requested access to the abandoned wing. My supervisor was reluctant, but eventually agreed when I fabricated a story about a patient's missing personal effects. In room 478, behind a loose baseboard exactly where Robert had described, I found a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Inside was a detailed account of Robert Emerson's final days, the excruciating pain, the calls for help that went unanswered, and the name of the night nurse who had failed him. I turned the journal in to hospital administration. An investigation was launched. Records were corrected. A formal apology was issued to Robert Emerson's surviving family members. I still work the night shift at St. Catherine's, but I no longer mind the eerie quiet of the deserted corridors. Sometimes I feel a certain presence, not threatening, but watchful. In those moments I whisper, "The truth is known now, Robert. You can rest." And somewhere in the emptiness, I swear I feel a sense of profound gratitude and release. A final acknowledgement before moving on. I still remember every detail of that house on Pine Street where we lived when I was 15. A typical suburban home in a quiet Minnesota neighborhood. 2 stories of faded blue siding, white trim that needed repainting, and a yard that my father meticulously maintained despite his 60-hour work weeks. My bedroom window faced the street, giving me a perfect view of our cul-de-sac and the dense woods that bordered our neighborhood. At 15, I was consumed by the usual teenage preoccupations: video games, avoiding homework, and navigating the social minefield of high school. My parents worked long hours, Mom as a nurse at the county hospital, Dad as a construction foreman. This left me alone most afternoons, something I considered a blessing rather than a cause for concern. That autumn was unusually cold. By mid-October, frost already decorated my bedroom window each morning, transforming the glass into delicate crystal patterns that I would trace with my fingertip while waiting for the school bus. The early darkness of those fall evenings made our neighborhood seem isolated, cut off from the rest of the world by shadows and silence. I hadn't yet learned to fear the dark. That would come later. The first time I noticed him was on a Tuesday. I remember because I had just finished a history test. I was certain I'd failed, and my mind was preoccupied with what excuse I could possibly give my parents. The afternoon sun was already setting as I walked home, casting long shadows across the pavement. Our street was empty as usual. Most of our neighbors were still at work, their houses standing silent and dark. I was halfway up our driveway when something made me stop and look back. That strange instinct that tells you you're being watched. Across the street, partially obscured by the Hendersons' mailbox, stood a man. He wasn't doing anything particularly suspicious, just standing there, hands in the pockets of a dark jacket, watching our house. When he saw me looking, he didn't hide or turn away. He simply nodded, as if we were acquaintances acknowledging each other in passing. Something about his stillness bothered me. In a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, a stranger stood out. But teenagers are remarkably skilled at dismissing concerns that might interrupt their routines, so I shrugged it off and went inside. That night at dinner, I mentioned the man to my parents. Probably just someone looking to buy in the neighborhood. My father said between bites of pot roast, "The Millers are selling their place." Or a delivery person who got lost, my mother added. Their casual dismissal reassured me, and I forgot about the incident, at least until 2 days later, when I saw him again. By the third sighting, it became impossible to ignore the pattern. The man always appeared around dusk, always alone, and always in a position with a clear view of our house, particularly my bedroom window. He never approached or did anything threatening. He simply watched. I began cataloging his appearances in a notebook. Tuesdays and Thursdays, always between 4:30 and 5:15 p.m. Never on weekends. always wearing the same dark jacket, regardless of the weather, always maintaining enough distance that his features remained indistinct, a shadow of a person rather than someone I could describe to police. I started taking different routes home, cutting through backyards and the small patch of woods behind our development. Sometimes I'd arrive home breathless, convinced I'd managed to avoid him, only to glance out the living room window and see him in his usual spot, as if he'd been there all along. My parents continued to dismiss my concerns, attributing my growing anxiety to an overactive imagination or the horror movies I occasionally watched with friends. The more I insisted, the more they worried about me rather than about the stranger. Maybe you should see Dr. Phillips again, my mother suggested one morning. Dr. Phillips was the therapist I'd briefly visited after my grandmother's death the previous year. You haven't been sleeping well. She was right about the sleep part. I'd begun having dreams about the man, dreams where he stood directly outside my window, his face pressed against the glass, watching me sleep. I'd wake up certain he was there, only to find nothing but darkness when I looked outside. In late November, the pattern changed. I came home from basketball practice to find my mother in the kitchen, her face pale. "Did you give your house key to anyone?" she asked, her voice strained. I shook my head. "Someone's been in the house," she said quietly. Nothing was stolen, nothing was damaged, but things had been moved, subtly repositioned in ways only the occupants would notice. Photo frames turned slightly, cushions rearranged, my desk chair pulled out at an angle I never used. And most disturbing of all, my notebook, the one where I documented the stranger's appearances, had been moved from my desk drawer to my pillow. The police came, took statements, dusted for fingerprints. They found nothing conclusive, no signs of forced entry. They suggested it might have been the wind from an open window or our own faulty memories about where we'd left things. That night, as I lay awake staring at my ceiling, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "I like watching you write about me." I deleted it immediately, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. I told myself it was a prank, a coincidence, anything but what I knew it to be. The next day, I skipped school and spent hours at the public library researching similar incidents in our area. What I found chilled me more than the stranger himself. 3 years earlier, in a neighborhood just 10 miles from ours, a family had reported similar experiences. A man watching their house, subtle evidence of intrusion. The reports stopped abruptly when their 16-year-old son disappeared. He was found 3 weeks later in a shallow grave in the woods. The case remained unsolved. 10 years have passed since that winter. I'm 25 now, living in a high-rise apartment in Chicago with security cameras and doormen who check every visitor. I should feel safe here. Most days, I almost convince myself that I am. The full truth about what happened during my 15th year is something I've shared with very few people. My parents, desperate to protect me, moved us across the country less than a month after the break-in. They told our relatives and friends it was for my father's new job opportunity. Only the 3 of us knew we were running. Before we left, there was one final incident, the one that still haunts my dreams and sends me checking door locks 3 times before bed. It was my last night in that house. Most of our belongings were already packed in moving boxes. I was sleeping on a mattress on the floor, my furniture already dismantled for transport. A sudden noise woke me, the unmistakable sound of my window sliding open. In the moonlight, I saw a hand pushing up the glass, then an arm, a shoulder. I lay frozen, unable to scream, as the stranger who had watched me for months began climbing into my bedroom. When he was halfway through the window, he paused and looked directly at me. In the silvery light, I finally saw his face clearly for the first time. It was utterly ordinary, the kind of face you'd pass 100 times on the street without noticing. but his eyes held an emptiness that seemed to pull all the warmth from the room. "I just wanted to know what it feels like," he said, his voice soft and conversational, "to live your life." Something in me snapped. I lunged for the baseball bat I'd kept beside my mattress since the break-in and swung it with all the strength my 15-year-old body possessed. It connected with his shoulder, sending him tumbling backward out the window. By the time my parents reached my room, by the time the police arrived, he was gone, leaving nothing but a smear of blood on the windowsill and footprints in the frost-covered grass below. They never found him. Sometimes I wonder if they ever really looked. Even now, a decade later, I occasionally glimpse someone standing across the street from my building. A figure in a dark jacket, hands in pockets, watching. Just watching. When I blink, he's gone, and I tell myself it's just my imagination, a trauma response my therapist has explained countless times. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, my phone buzzes with a message from an unknown number. I never read them anymore. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some watchers never stop watching. I never should have taken that shortcut. That's what I keep telling myself, even now, months after that night on Route 16. Some decisions seem so innocent in the moment, a simple choice to save time, but end up changing everything. My name is Daniel Mercer, and until that night, I was just another overworked sales representative for a pharmaceutical company. My territory covered 5 states across the Midwest, which meant endless hours on America's highways, moving from one anonymous hotel to the next. That particular evening, I was driving from Omaha to Kansas City, a 4-hour stretch I'd done dozens of times before. It was late October, and darkness had fallen early. The forecast had predicted clear skies, but a thick fog had rolled in unexpectedly, reducing visibility to mere yards ahead of my headlights. I should have stopped for the night in Lincoln, found a motel, and continued in the morning. But I had an important meeting at 9 a.m. the next day, and my boss had made it clear that weather excuses weren't acceptable. So I pressed on, the glow of my dashboard the only consistent light as the highway unfolded before me. The radio stations had long since dissolved into static, and my Spotify playlist had cycled through 3 times. My eyelids felt like they had weights attached to them. I cracked the window, letting the cold autumn air slap against my face. I cranked the AC to maximum, the icy blast making me shiver. I even resorted to pinching my thigh hard enough to leave marks. Anything to stay awake for the final 100 miles. None of it was working. The white lines of the highway had begun to hypnotize me, my mind drifting despite my best efforts. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to pull over, but pride and stubborn determination kept my foot on the accelerator. That's when I saw the sign for Route 16, a state highway that cut diagonally across to Kansas City. According to my GPS, it would save me nearly 40 minutes, a detour from the familiar interstate, but in my exhausted state, the promise of reaching my destination sooner was irresistible. I took the exit, and that's when everything changed. Route 16 was nothing like the well-maintained interstate I'd left behind. It was a 2-lane highway that seemed to have been forgotten by the Department of Transportation. The asphalt was cracked in places, with faded lines that disappeared completely in the fog. There were no streetlights, only the occasional reflective marker indicating a sharp turn ahead. Within minutes, I realized my mistake. What had appeared on the GPS as a shortcut was actually a meandering road that twisted through farmland and small, uninhabited areas. The fog grew thicker, settling into the low valleys and creating an impenetrable wall of white that my headlights struggled to penetrate. Worse still, there was no cell service. The bars on my phone had disappeared completely, and my GPS kept recalculating before giving up entirely, leaving me with a useless signal lost message. I was navigating blind, with only the occasional road sign to confirm I was still on Route 16. The clock on my dashboard read 11:42 p.m. when I first noticed how low my fuel gauge was. The needle hovered just above the red, a situation I normally never allowed to happen. I prided myself on my road trip preparedness, always filling up when I hit a quarter tank. But the unexpected detour and my fatigue had made me careless. Now I faced a new problem, finding gas in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night, surrounded by fog. I strained my eyes looking for any sign of civilization. A porch light, a gas station sign, anything that would indicate I wasn't completely alone on the stretch of forgotten highway. For 20 agonizing minutes, I saw nothing but the same monotonous landscape. Fields of corn, harvested weeks ago, their stubble creating eerie silhouettes in my headlights. Abandoned barns listing to one side, their wooden frames rotting back into the earth. Not a single house with lights on, not a single cross street with signs of life. The fuel light blinked on, its orange glow a warning I couldn't ignore. According to the car's computer, I had approximately 30 miles left before I would be stranded. I considered turning back, but I had no idea how far I'd come on Route 16, or if there was anything behind me either. My only option was to continue forward and hope for a miracle. It happened so quickly that later I would question if it had happened at all. My eyelids, heavy from hours of driving, closed for what I thought was just a fraction of a second, a blink that lasted a heartbeat too long. But when my eyes opened, something had changed. The fog had somehow shifted. Where before it had been a consistent wall of white, now it seemed to swirl in patterns, creating tunnels and pathways through the mist. And through one of these temporary clearings, I saw it, a soft glow in the distance, the unmistakable illumination of a gas station sign. Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I let out a sound, half laugh, half sob. I pressed the accelerator, urging my car toward the promise of fuel and perhaps a cup of coffee strong enough to get me through the remainder of my journey. As I drew closer, the sign came into focus. Last stop, gas and convenience. Below it in smaller letters, 24 hours. It was an older station, not one of the major chains that dotted the interstates. The kind of place that still had analog pumps and probably sold homemade sandwiches wrapped in plastic. I pulled off the highway, my tires crunching over gravel as I navigated into the station's small lot. The place was eerily quiet, with none of the usual ambient noise you'd expect. No cars passing on the highway, no insects buzzing around the fluorescent lights, not even the hum of refrigeration units from inside the store. Still, the lights were on, the pumps appeared to be working, and at that moment, that was all that mattered to me. I pulled up to the nearest pump, shut off the engine, and stepped out into the night. The air felt different here. Heavier, somehow, with a metallic taste that coated the back of my throat. I chalked it up to the fog and the late hour, my senses playing tricks on me due to exhaustion. I reached for the pump handle, inserted my credit card into the reader, and waited for the authorization. The machine beeped, displaying a simple message, "Please see cashier." Sighing, I replaced the nozzle and headed toward the store, the bell above the door announcing my entrance with a discordant jingle. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh white glow that made the already sterile environment feel clinical. The shelves were stocked with the usual gas station fare, chips, candy, energy drinks, and various automotive supplies. But something felt off about the arrangement. Everything was too perfect, too precisely aligned, as if someone had just finished setting up a display rather than managing a working store. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet space. "Anyone here?" No response. I moved toward the counter, expecting to find an employee who had stepped away momentarily, or was perhaps in a back room. The register was on, its screen displaying a screensaver of swirling colors. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. "I need to pay for gas." Still nothing. A coffee pot sat on a burner behind the counter, the dark liquid inside steaming as if freshly brewed. Beside it, a rack of donuts sat under a plastic cover, looking remarkably fresh for a remote gas station at this hour. I noticed a small bell on the counter, the kind you ring for service. I tapped it, and the sharp ding echoed through the store. Once, twice, 3 times I rang it, each chime seeming to hang in the air longer than it should have. No one came. I pulled out my phone, thinking perhaps I could call the main number of the gas station, which might be posted somewhere. To my surprise, I now had 1 bar of service, just enough to potentially make a call. But before I could search for a number, something caught my eye. On the wall behind the counter was a bulletin board covered with the usual community notices: lost pets, local events, business cards. Among them was a yellowed newspaper clipping, its edges curled with age. The headline read, "Last stop gas station to close after 40 years." The date on the clipping, October 17th, 1997. I blinked hard, certain I'd misread. This clearly wasn't a closed business. The lights were on, the coffee was hot, everything was fully stocked. Yet as I looked more closely at my surroundings, I began to notice other inconsistencies. The candy bars on display were in outdated packaging I hadn't seen since I was a kid. The soda refrigerator contained brands that had changed their logos years ago. And the calendar hanging beside the register was open to October 1997. Each previous day exited out methodically up to the 17th. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down my spine. I backed away from the counter, a sense of wrongness building inside me. Something about this place was fundamentally not right, beyond just the absence of an attendant. The perfect arrangement of products, the outdated packaging, the newspaper clipping, it all pointed to something I couldn't quite comprehend. I decided the best course of action was to leave, to get back in my car and take my chances on finding another gas station before running empty. But as I turned toward the door, I noticed something I'd missed on my way in. A small office behind the counter, its door slightly ajar. "Hello?" I called one more time, moving hesitantly toward the office. "I just need to pay for some gas. Is anyone here?" The door creaked as I pushed it open wider, revealing a cramped space with a desk, filing cabinet, and small security monitor showing 4 camera feeds. The desk was cluttered with paperwork, an ancient desktop computer, and various personal items. A coffee mug with "Narm1 Dad" printed on it. A small framed photo facing away from me, a half-completed crossword puzzle. It looked as if someone had just stepped away momentarily and would return any second. Yet the layer of dust on everything suggested otherwise. I was about to leave when my eyes fell on the security monitor. The top left screen showed the front of the store where my car was parked at the pump. The top right displayed the inside of the store I just walked through. The bottom left showed what appeared to be a storage room. It was the bottom right screen that made my blood freeze. It showed another angle of the store interior, but different from how I'd just seen it. The shelves were partly empty, some knocked over entirely. The front windows were boarded up, and dust motes floated through beams of light coming from holes in the ceiling. It was the same store, but abandoned, derelict, long since closed. My hands trembling, I reached for the framed photo on the desk and turned it toward me. It showed a middle-aged man with a mustache, his arm around a teenage boy, both smiling in front of the very gas station I was in. On the bottom of the frame was a small brass plate with an inscription: "In memory of Frank Williams, 1952-1997. My heartbeat pounding in my ears, I noticed a newspaper on the desk, partially covered by other papers. I slid it out, and my stomach dropped at the headline: Local gas station owner dies in robbery. According to the article, Frank Williams, owner of Last Stop Gas and Convenience, had been killed during a late-night robbery on October 17, 1997. The perpetrator had never been caught. Frank had been alone that night, his teenage son home with the flu instead of working his usual shift. The gas station had closed permanently after his death, the property tied up in legal issues and eventually abandoned. The article mentioned that locals avoided the place, claiming it felt wrong somehow. October 17, 1997. Exactly 26 years ago to the day, I needed to leave immediately. Whatever was happening here, whatever explanation there might be for an abandoned gas station appearing fully operational, I didn't want to know. My exhaustion was forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and primal fear. I backed out of the office, turning quickly to head for the exit. That's when I saw him. A man stood behind the counter where no one had been moments before, middle-aged, with a mustache and weary eyes that matched the photo I'd just seen. He wore a red vest with a name tag that read Frank. "Find everything you need?" he asked, his voice oddly flat, as if he were reading from a script. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up, my mind racing to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be happening. The man before me had been dead for 26 years. Just gas, I finally managed to stammer. "Pump 3. He nodded, punching something into the register with deliberate movements. "That'll be $17.63, he said, still in that same monotone voice. With shaking hands, I pulled out my wallet and extracted a $20 bill. As I extended it toward him, our fingers brushed during the exchange. His skin was ice cold. "You look tired, son," he said as he counted out my change. "Long drive ahead?" I nodded mutely, wanting nothing more than to grab my change and run. "Dangerous to drive so tired," he continued, his eyes never leaving mine. "I should know. The night I died, I was pulling a double shift. So exhausted I didn't even hear the bell when he came in." He pushed my change across the counter. Never saw the gun until it was too late. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. "Every year on this night, I'm back here," Frank said, his voice suddenly more present, more real. "Waiting for someone like you, someone who needs a warning." "A warning?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "About what happens when you push too far, when you think you're invincible." He leaned forward slightly. "Pull over, son. The next place you decide to rest your eyes for just a moment won't be as forgiving as I am." The lights flickered then, once, twice, and in that momentary darkness, something changed in Frank's appearance. For just an instant, I saw him as he must have been in his final moments. A bloodied wound in his chest, his eyes vacant, his skin gray. When the light stabilized, he was gone. The counter was empty, a layer of dust covering the surface where he had stood. The register was dark, unpowered. The coffee pot was dry and cracked with age. I fled. There's no other word for it. I ran from that store as if the devil himself were at my heels, not stopping until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys in my panic to unlock the door. Inside, I sat gasping for breath, trying to process what had just happened. Had I hallucinated the entire encounter? Was this some extreme manifestation of exhaustion? My brain creating an elaborate scenario to force me to stop driving? But then my eyes fell on the receipt clutched in my hand. A receipt from Last Stop Gas and Convenience, dated October 17, 2023, for $17.63 of regular unleaded gasoline. And in the corner, scrawled in hasty handwriting, "Pull over. Please." I looked up at the store through my windshield. In the harsh light of reality, it was clearly abandoned. Windows boarded up, weeds growing through cracks in the concrete, the sign fallen on one side, exactly as it had appeared on that security monitor. Yet my fuel gauge now read full. With trembling hands, I started the engine and pulled carefully back onto Route 16. The fog had lifted somewhat, enough that I could see the road more clearly. About a mile down the highway, I spotted a rest area and pulled in, parking in a well-lit spot near the entrance. I reclined my seat, set an alarm on my phone for 2 hours later, and closed my eyes. Sleep came instantly, dreamless and deep. When I awoke, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow across the landscape. Route 16 looked completely different in the daylight, still rural and isolated, but nowhere near as menacing as it had seemed the night before. Before continuing my journey, I decided to look up the last stop gas station online, now that I had cell service again. It took some digging, but I found an old news article confirming everything. Frank Williams' murder during a robbery, the station's closure afterward, the property that had sat abandoned for decades. There was a follow-up article from just 3 years ago. A driver had fallen asleep at the wheel less than a mile from the abandoned gas station, veering into oncoming traffic and killing both himself and a family of 4 in the other vehicle. The accident had happened on October 18th, the day after the anniversary of Frank's death. I've never taken a shortcut since that night. I stop when I'm tired, no matter what meeting or deadline looms the next day. And every October 17th, I think about Frank Williams and the warning he gave me, a warning I believe saved my life. Sometimes I wonder how many others he's warned over the years. How many listened? How many didn't? And I wonder if someday, when whatever debt he feels he owes is finally paid, Frank will get to move on from that lonely gas station on Route 16, his eternal night shift finally over. The Oregon coast in early October belongs to the locals. The summer tourists have long since packed up their beach umbrellas and returned to their inland lives, leaving behind stretches of pristine shoreline where you can walk for hours without encountering another soul. It was exactly this solitude that had drawn me to Crescent Cove that morning, a small, secluded beach tucked between 2 rocky headlands about 20 miles south of Cannon Beach. My daughter, Emma, had just turned 3 the week before. She was in that magical phase of childhood where everything is an adventure, where wet sand between toes elicits peals of laughter and each discovered seashell is a treasure beyond compare. My wife, Sarah, had stayed home with a migraine, urging us to go ahead with our planned beach day. "Take pictures," she'd mumbled from beneath her eye mask as we slipped out the door of our rental cottage. The day was perfect for beachcombing, overcast but not threatening rain, with a gentle breeze that carried the salt-heavy scent of the Pacific. Emma wore her favorite yellow raincoat despite the mild temperature, insisting that proper explorers needed proper gear. Her strawberry blonde curls bounced beneath the hood as she ran ahead of me, her small booted feet leaving a trail of impressions in the damp sand. "Look for treasure, Daddy," she called over her shoulder, already scanning the tide line for shells and sea glass. I followed at a casual pace, my camera hanging from my neck, occasionally stopping to take photos of Emma against the dramatic backdrop of fog-shrouded rocks and silver-gray waves. We had the entire beach to ourselves, or so I thought. The isolation that had initially seemed so appealing would soon take on a more sinister quality. "Stay where I can see you, sweetie," I called as Emma disappeared around a large piece of driftwood. A flash of yellow raincoat reappeared as she waved acknowledgement, her smile visible even from 30 yards away. It's strange how the mind works in retrospect, how certain details become sharply focused while others fade. I remember thinking how perfect this moment was, just a father and his daughter exploring nature together, building memories that would someday be childhood stories. I remember the way the light filtered through breaks in the clouds, creating spotlights on the water. I remember the distant cry of gulls. I don't remember seeing the van parked on the access road above the beach. I should have noticed it. I should have wondered why someone would drive to this remote spot and not come down to the beach. I should have been more vigilant, but I wasn't. And that moment of parental complacency nearly cost me everything. The first signs of trouble weren't dramatic. There was no ominous music swelling in the background, as there would be in a movie. Just a subtle shift in the environment that triggered that ancient part of the brain that senses threat before consciously identifying it. Emma had wandered about 50 yards ahead of me, crouched by a tide pool near the base of the northern headland. The rock formation created a natural barrier that partially obscured my view of her. I was photographing a particularly photogenic piece of driftwood when I noticed movement at the edge of my peripheral vision. Someone descending the narrow trail from the parking area to the beach. A man, wearing a dark windbreaker and baseball cap, pulled low over his face. Nothing inherently suspicious about that. Plenty of locals enjoyed solitary walks on deserted beaches, but something about his purposeful stride made me straighten up and take notice. He wasn't strolling, he was heading directly toward the rocks where Emma was playing and moving with an urgency that seemed out of place. I lowered my camera and began walking more quickly toward my daughter. The distance between us suddenly seemed vast. "Emma," I called. "Come back this way, honey." She was too absorbed in her discoveries to hear me. The man was now halfway to her position, moving at an angle that would intercept her before I could reach her. Still, I told myself I was overreacting. Not every stranger is a threat. But I quickened my pace anyway. Then I saw the second man. He had appeared from behind the headland rocks, which meant he must have been waiting there all along. He too was moving toward my daughter, casually, as if simply walking the beach. But his trajectory was unmistakable. They were converging on Emma from two directions. My walk became a jog, then a sprint. "Emma," I shouted, my voice carrying over the sound of the waves. "Emma, come to Daddy right now." This time she heard me. She looked up, saw me running, and stood up from her tide pools. But instead of running toward me, she turned and saw the man approaching from the rocks. Even from a distance, I could see her friendly wave. Emma had never met a stranger. Everyone was a potential friend in her world. The man waved back and said something I couldn't hear. Emma took a step toward him. My heart slammed against my ribcage. I was still too far away. "Emma, stop," I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. "Come to me right now." Something in my tone finally registered with her. She hesitated, looking between me and the man. Confusion evident even at a distance. The man from the rocks crouched down to her level, speaking to her with an animated expression, pointing at something in the tide pools as if sharing her enthusiasm for beach treasures. The second man had slowed his approach, pretending to skip stones into the water while maintaining his position between Emma and me. They were coordinating their movements with practiced precision. I was close enough now to see Emma's uncertain expression. The man was showing her something in his hand, something small that caught the light. A shell, perhaps, or a piece of sea glass. Classic predator behavior, offering something enticing to gain trust. "Emma," I called again, trying to keep my voice calm despite the terror coursing through me. "Remember what we said about strangers? Come here right now, baby." The man by the tide pools glanced up at me, his face partially obscured by his cap, but his posture suddenly tense. He said something else to Emma, then straightened and took a half step back, as if recognizing that his approach had been too obvious. I was 30 yards away now. 25. The second man had positioned himself directly in my path, his attention seemingly focused on the waves, but his body angled to intercept me. "Hen," I called out to him, my voice dropping to a lower, more confrontational register. "Move aside." He turned toward me with practiced surprise, as if just noticing my presence. "Sorry, man," he said with an affable smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "That's my daughter." I said, not slowing my pace. Move. Now. Something in my expression must have told him I wasn't going to be easily deterred. His smile faltered, and he took a half step to the side, not enough to clear my path completely, but enough that continuing to block me would be an obvious act of aggression. I brushed past him, close enough to catch the scent of cigarettes and something medicinal on his breath. Close enough to see the walkie-talkie partially concealed in his jacket pocket. Close enough to notice the lack of beach sand on his boots, suggesting he hadn't been walking along the shore at all. "Emma, come here," I called, now only 15 yards from my daughter. The first man had retreated a few steps but was still hovering nearby. Emma, sensing the tension, had finally started moving toward me, clutching something in her small fist. "The nice man gave me a pretty rock, Daddy," she said as I reached her, scooping her up into my arms with enough force to make her squeal in surprise. "We need to go," I said, already turning back toward the beach access point, my eyes scanning for the quickest escape route. The first man spoke, his voice surprisingly soft. "Cute kid, looks just like you." It wasn't a compliment. It was a message. We know what she looks like. We could find her again. With Emma secured in my arms, I began walking rapidly toward the beach access trail, my mind racing through our options. Our car was parked in the small gravel lot at the top of the trail, the same lot where I now suspected the men's van was waiting. But there was no other way off this beach except for a treacherous climb over the headland rocks, impossible while carrying a child. I glanced back over my shoulder. The two men had come together and were talking in low voices, occasionally looking in our direction. They weren't pursuing us yet, but they weren't leaving either. "Daddy, you're squishing me," Emma complained, squirming in my tight grip. "Sorry, sweetie," I said, loosening my hold slightly but maintaining a brisk pace. "We need to get back to the car quickly." "But I didn't find enough treasures yet," she protested. "We'll come back another day," I promised, knowing we would never set foot on this beach again. I reached the base of the access trail and began climbing the wooden steps cut into the hillside, my legs burning with the effort of carrying Emma's weight. The trail wound up through scrubby pine trees and beach grass, offering momentary cover from the men's view, but also preventing me from seeing if they were following. Halfway up, I stopped to catch my breath and listen. The sound of footsteps on the wooden steps below confirmed my fears. They were coming after us, not running, but climbing steadily, confidently, like predators who know their prey has limited escape options. "We're going to play a game," I whispered to Emma, setting her down on the step beside me. "It's called super quiet, fast walking. We need to get to the car without making any noise. If we win, we get ice cream." Emma's eyes widened at the mention of ice cream, and she nodded solemnly, her earlier protests forgotten. I took her hand, and we continued up the stairs as quickly and quietly as possible. When we emerged from the trail into the small parking area, my worst fears were confirmed. A dark blue van with tinted windows was parked beside our compact rental car. No license plate on the front, no identifying marks, just like we'd taught Emma. Stranger. Danger. I fumbled in my pocket for the car keys, cursing the seconds it took to locate them. The men's voices were closer now, still on the trail, but approaching the top. I hit the unlock button, opened the rear door, and lifted Emma into her car seat. "Quick buckling game," I said, trying to keep my voice light as I fastened the straps with trembling fingers. As I closed the back door and moved toward the driver's side, the first man emerged from the trail. Without the partial concealment of his cap, I could now see his face clearly. Unremarkable features arranged in an expression of calculated neutrality. A face designed to be forgettable. Our eyes met across the small parking lot. Neither of us pretended anymore. "Nice day at the beach," he called, his tone casual but his intent unmistakable, as the second man appeared behind him. "Shame you have to leave so soon." I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, hands shaking as I jabbed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse just as the men began moving toward us. The gravel parking lot was small, requiring a three-point turn to exit. As I maneuvered, the blue van suddenly started up, its driver, a third man I hadn't seen, positioning it to block the narrow exit road. "Hang on, Emma," I said, meeting her confused eyes in the rearview mirror. I stepped on the gas, swerving around the van with inches to spare, scraping our rental car against the sandstone wall that lined one side of the exit. As we accelerated onto the coastal highway, I saw the blue van pull out behind us. The next hour remains a blur in my memory. A high-speed journey along winding coastal roads, constantly checking the rearview mirror for signs of the blue van. I called 911 on speakerphone while driving, trying to keep my voice calm enough to explain the situation without frightening Emma, who was singing to herself in the back seat, oblivious to the danger we had narrowly escaped. The dispatcher directed me to the nearest police station in Seaside, where officers took my statement and put out an alert for the van. They didn't find it. They never would. Vehicles like that, nondescript, probably stolen or using stolen plates, are chosen specifically because they can disappear. Later that evening, back in our rental cottage with the doors double locked and a chair wedged under the knob for good measure, I examined the pretty rock the man had given Emma. It wasn't a rock at all, but a smooth piece of green sea glass with a tiny pinprick hole drilled through one end, as if it were meant to be strung on a necklace. Or perhaps, more disturbingly, as if it were meant to be identified later. Sarah held me as I finally broke down, the delayed shock of what had nearly happened hitting me with physical force. Emma slept peacefully in the next room, unaware that she had almost become a statistic, a face on a missing poster, a lifetime of trauma for her parents. We cut our vacation short and drove home the next day, taking random detours and checking constantly for any vehicle that seemed to be following us for too long. For weeks afterward, I would jolt awake at night, convinced I had heard footsteps outside Emma's window. That was 5 years ago. Emma is 8 now and has no memory of what happened at Crescent Cove. We've never told her the full story. Someday we will, when she's old enough to understand the dangers that exist in the world without becoming paralyzed by fear of them. I still have the piece of sea glass, locked in a small safe in my office. A reminder of how quickly an ordinary day can turn into a nightmare. A reminder that the true monsters don't have fangs or claws. They have vans with tinted windows and unremarkable faces and walkie-talkies to coordinate their hunts. Sometimes I wonder about the other children who might have crossed paths with those men. The ones who didn't have someone watching closely enough. The ones who might have been enticed by a pretty piece of sea glass or a friendly smile. The ones whose parents might still be waiting, hoping, praying for a resolution that will never come. I hold Emma a little tighter these days. I watch a little more carefully, and I never ever take a moment with her for granted. Because I know how easily that moment could have been our last. Financial desperation makes you consider options you'd normally dismiss without a second thought. That's how I, Marcus Reed, a former high school English teacher with a master's degree in literature, ended up accepting a position as a night security guard at Grayson Heights, one of Denver's oldest luxury apartment buildings. The pay wasn't great, $18.50 an hour, but after 6 months of unemployment following district-wide budget cuts, my savings had evaporated, and the rent on my modest one-bedroom apartment wasn't going to pay itself. The job market for teachers in Colorado had become a wasteland, and I needed something, anything, to keep afloat while I continued my search for a teaching position. It's straightforward work. The building manager, Mr. Hoffman, had explained during my interview. You'll monitor the security cameras, make hourly rounds, assist residents if they need help after hours, and report any suspicious activity. Your shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. 5 nights a week. When he showed me the security office, a small room in the basement with monitors, a desk, and a coffee maker, I felt a pang of regret. Just 6 months ago, I'd been discussing Steinbeck and Hemingway with bright-eyed teenagers. Now I'd be watching empty hallways for 8 hours a night. The previous guard quit rather suddenly, Mr. Hoffman mentioned as he handed me the keys and a flashlight. Personal reasons, he said, didn't even give proper notice. Something in his tone made me wonder if there was more to the story, but I didn't press the issue. I needed the job too badly. One more thing, he added, almost as an afterthought. The residents in 512 value their privacy. Miss Eleanor Grayson. Yes, from the Grayson family that built this place back in 1937. She's our oldest resident, 93 now. She sometimes wanders the halls at night due to insomnia. Just make sure she gets back to her apartment safely if you see her, but don't engage unless necessary. She can be particular. I nodded, thinking it was a simple enough instruction. Just a courtesy to an elderly resident whose family name was on the building. I had no idea that apartment 512 would become the focus of my increasing unease over the coming weeks. Grayson Heights stood as a testament to Art Deco opulence in downtown Denver. 12 stories of limestone and brass with intricate geometric patterns adorning its facade. From the outside, it projected an air of timeless elegance. Inside, however, the building told a different story. While the lobby maintained its original grandeur, marble floors, wood-paneled walls, and brass fixtures polished to a gleam, the rest of the building existed in a state of faded glory. The hallway carpets, though clean, were worn thin in places. The brass elevator doors were dulled with age, and the mechanism creaked and groaned as it moved between floors. During my orientation tour, Mr. Hoffman had pointed out the building's historical significance while glossing over its evident decay. We're planning renovations soon, he'd said, though the dusty construction permits displayed in the lobby were dated 3 years earlier. Most of the residents were older, people who had lived in the building for decades and seemed content with its gradual decline. There were a few younger professionals who'd been attracted by the central location and relative affordability. Luxury apartments from the 1930s commanded less rent than modern high-rises, with amenities like gyms and rooftop pools. The basement, where my security office was located, was a maze of narrow corridors connecting various utility rooms, storage areas, and the laundry facilities. The concrete walls were painted an institutional green that had faded to a sickly hue over the decades. Pipes ran along the ceiling, occasionally dripping condensation onto the floor. My office itself was sparse. A metal desk, 3 monitors showing feeds from various cameras throughout the building, a logbook, and a mini-fridge. The previous guard had left nothing personal behind, not even a coffee mug or a forgotten pen. What he had left, however, was a series of notes in the logbook that became increasingly concerning as I read through them. September 3. Noise complaint from 511. Says banging coming from 512 at 3 a.m. Checked with Miss Grayson, who was asleep. No source of noise found. September 7. Another complaint from 511 about noises. Miss Grayson not in her apartment when I checked. Found her in the 5th floor east stairwell, confused. Escorted her back to 512. September 15. Cameras on 5th floor keep malfunctioning between 2 to 4 a.m. Maintenance says it's electrical issues from old wiring. September 22. Found Miss Grayson standing outside 511 at 3:17 a.m. She seemed agitated, saying he needs to give it back. Resident of 511, Mr. Winters, was not home. escorted Miss Grayson back to her apartment. The entries continued in this vein, becoming increasingly erratic in both handwriting and content, until they stopped abruptly on October 7th, just 3 days before I was hired. The final entry simply read, "I can't do this anymore." The sounds aren't coming from her apartment. They're coming from inside the walls. My first few nights at Grayson Heights passed uneventfully. I'd arrive at 9:45 p.m., receive a brief update from the evening concierge before they left at 10, and then settle in for my shift. Every hour, I'd make a round of the building, starting at the top floor and working my way down, checking that all exit doors were secure and nothing seemed out of place. The building was largely quiet after midnight. Occasionally, I'd encounter a resident returning late or help someone who had locked themselves out, but most interactions were brief and professional. I didn't see Miss Grayson during those first few nights, though I paid special attention to the 5th floor during my rounds. Apartment 512 was at the end of the east corridor, directly across from a service elevator that was rarely used. Unlike the other apartment doors, which had been updated over the years, hers retained the original dark wood with ornate brass numbering. On my 4th night, I experienced my first oddity. During my 2 a.m. round, I noticed that the temperature on the 5th floor was noticeably colder than the rest of the building. Cold enough that I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I made a note to inform maintenance, assuming it was an issue with the heating system. As I passed apartment 511, I heard what sounded like furniture being moved, a scraping sound against the hardwood floors. Given the hour, I paused to listen, wondering if I should check on the resident. The sound came again, but this time I realized it wasn't coming from inside apartment 511. It seemed to be coming from the wall itself, in the space between 511 and 512. I pressed my ear against the wallpaper, its once elegant pattern now faded and peeling in places. The scraping had stopped, but I could hear something else, a sound like fingernails tapping rhythmically against the other side of the wall. My first instinct was to knock on Miss Grayson's door to see if she needed assistance, but I remembered Mr. Hoffman's warning about respecting her privacy. Instead, I made a note in the logbook and continued my rounds. When I passed the 5th floor again an hour later, the temperature had returned to normal, and all was quiet. The next night, I checked the building's blueprints, which were kept in a filing cabinet in my office. According to the original plans from 1937, there was no space between apartments 511 and 512. They shared a common wall. Whatever I'd heard couldn't have been coming from between the units. I was still puzzling over this when the phone at my desk rang shortly after 3 a.m. "Security," I answered. "This is James Winters in 511, came an irritated voice. "The noise is back. Can you please do something about it this time?" I assured him I'd investigate immediately and headed up to the 5th floor. This time, the corridor was at a normal temperature, but as I approached apartment 511, I could hear it clearly, a rhythmic scraping followed by what sounded like whispering. Mr. Winters, a man in his early 40s with dark circles under his eyes, met me in the hallway. "It's been going on for weeks," he said, keeping his voice low. "The previous guard kept saying he couldn't hear anything, or that Miss Grayson was just moving furniture. But listen to that. Does that sound like furniture to you?" We both stood silently, listening to the unmistakable sound of whispering coming from inside the wall. "Have you spoken to Miss Grayson about it?" I asked. A strange expression crossed his face. "Haven't seen her in person for months. She doesn't answer her door anymore. The only way I know she's still alive is I sometimes hear her talking to someone in there." I thanked him and promised to look into the matter, though I wasn't sure what I could actually do. As I approached Miss Grayson's door, the whispering stopped abruptly. I stood there for several minutes, debating whether to knock, but ultimately decided against it. It was 3:30 a.m., and disturbing a 93-year-old woman because of what might just be old pipes or settling wood seemed inappropriate.
As I turned to leave, I distinctly heard a woman's voice from inside apartment 512, elderly but clear. "He's gone now. You can come out again." And then a second voice, deeper, raspier, responded, "He'll be back. They always come back." I froze, my hand instinctively moving to the radio at my belt. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else in that apartment. Before I could decide on a course of action, the service elevator across from 5112 suddenly activated, its ancient motor groaning to life. I hadn't called it, and according to the motion sensors that fed into our security system, no one else was on the 5th floor except for Mr. Winters, Miss Grayson, and myself. The elevator arrived with a ponderous ding, its doors sliding open to reveal an empty car. As I stared into it, confused, the lights in the hallway flickered once, twice, and then steadied. When I looked back at apartment 512, a handwritten note had appeared on the door, secured with yellowed tape. "Please don't disturb us again." I swear it hadn't been there moments before. The note unsettled me enough that I spent much of my 5th night researching the history of Grayson Heights between my regular rounds. The building's website offered a sanitized account of its construction by the prominent Grayson family in 1937, its heyday as one of Denver's most prestigious addresses through the 1950s, and its gradual transition to a mix of owned and rented units in more recent decades. What it didn't mention was anything unusual about apartment 512 or its elderly occupant. So during my 4 a.m. coffee break, I turned to online newspaper archives, searching for anything related to the building or the Grayson family. Most articles were mundane. Society page mentions of galas and charity events hosted by the Graysons, announcements of prominent new tenants, or coverage of the building's historical designation in the 1980s. But a small article from 1962 caught my attention.
Grayson Heights tragedy, service worker found dead. The article was brief, describing how a maintenance worker named Robert Capaldi had been found dead in the service elevator, apparently from a heart attack. He had been 52 years old and had worked in the building for nearly 20 years. What struck me as odd was the mention that his body had been discovered by Miss Eleanor Grayson, daughter of the building's founder, who had heard unusual noises from the elevator shaft adjacent to her apartment and called for help. Eleanor Grayson would have been in her early 30s then. The same Eleanor Grayson who now, at 93, still occupied apartment 512. I dug deeper and found another article from 1965, Missing Grayson Heights Resident Case Closed. This one detailed how James Morris, a tenant who had lived in apartment 511, had been officially declared dead after disappearing 2 years earlier. His apartment had been found undisturbed, with no signs of foul play. The police had eventually concluded that Morris, who had suffered from depression, had likely taken his own life somewhere off premises, though his body had never been found. The article mentioned that neighbor Miss Eleanor Grayson had been the last person to see Morris alive, having exchanged pleasantries with him the evening before his disappearance. As my shift neared its end, I found one more relevant article from 1983. Renovation uncovers surprise at historic Grayson Heights. During a renovation of the 5th floor, workers had discovered a previously unknown space between apartments 511 and 512, a narrow maintenance shaft that had been sealed off during earlier remodeling. The article treated it as a quirky architectural discovery, noting that such hidden spaces weren't uncommon in older buildings where modifications had been made over the decades. What the article didn't explain was why the shaft had been sealed in the first place. or what, if anything, had been found inside it when it was reopened. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I had developed a theory. The noises Mr. Winters was hearing were coming from this rediscovered maintenance shaft between the apartments. Perhaps it had become a nesting place for rodents or raccoons that had found their way into the building. It was a rational explanation that accounted for the strange sounds. What it didn't explain was the second voice I'd heard from inside Miss Grayson's apartment, or the note that had appeared on her door. As I was leaving, I passed the incoming day concierge, a friendly woman in her 60s named Gloria, who had worked in the building for over a decade. "How are you finding the night shift?" she asked, as we exchanged pleasantries. "Interesting," I replied, then added casually, "Have you ever met Miss Grayson in 512? Gloria's smile faltered slightly. "Eleanor? Not for years. She doesn't come down anymore. Management brings her groceries and checks on her weekly. Doctor visits her at home." She lowered her voice. "Between us, I'm not sure how she's still managing on her own at her age. But the Graysons built this place. No one's going to force her into a home." "Does she have any visitors?" I asked, thinking of the second voice I'd heard. Gloria looked puzzled. "Visitors? Not that I've ever seen. She's outlived everyone she knew, poor thing." "Why do you ask?" I made an excuse about hearing voices from her apartment during my rounds, suggesting perhaps she had a television on. "Could be," Gloria said, though she didn't sound convinced. "Though I've heard she hasn't owned a TV since the 90s. Says she doesn't trust modern technology." She shrugged. "Old people, you know? They get set in their ways." As I walked to my car, Gloria's words kept repeating in my mind. She's outlived everyone she knew. Then who was the other person in her apartment? My sixth night started routinely enough. I arrived, checked the logbook, nothing unusual noted by the evening concierge, and settled in for my shift. Around midnight, I began my first round. When I reached the 5th floor, I immediately noticed the drop in temperature again. This time, it was even colder than before, so cold that the brass doorknobs had developed a thin layer of frost. As I approached apartment 511, Mr. Winters emerged, wrapped in a heavy robe, his expression a mix of anger and fear. "It's been non-stop since sunset," he said without preamble. "Scraping, thumping, whispering. I've called management 3 times this week. They keep saying they'll look into it." I nodded sympathetically. "I've been doing some research on the building. Did you know there's actually a maintenance shaft between your apartment and Miss Grayson's? It was discovered during renovations in the 80s. The noise could be coming from there." He looked at me blankly. "A shaft? You mean like an air duct or something?" "More like a narrow service corridor, from what I understand. It might have been designed for access to pipes or electrical wiring. These old buildings often have unusual architectural features." Mr. Winters seemed to consider this. "So what's making the noise in there? Rats?" "Possibly," I said, not wanting to dismiss his concerns, but also not wanting to alarm him unnecessarily. "I'm going to speak with Miss Grayson tonight, see if she's hearing the same things." He laughed bitterly. "Good luck with that. No one ever sees her. I've lived here for 3 years and I've never once encountered her in the hallway or elevator." As if on cue, we both heard a clear, distinct sound from inside the wall, a low, sustained moan that was unmistakably human. Mr. Winters paled. "That is not a rat." Before I could respond, the door to apartment 512 opened for the first time since I'd started working at Grayson Heights. A small, frail woman emerged, leaning heavily on an ornate cane. Her white hair was arranged in an elegant style that hadn't been fashionable for decades, and she wore a silk dressing gown that might once have been crimson, but had faded to a dusty rose. "Mr. Winters," she said, her voice surprisingly strong for someone her age, "I must insist you stop harassing the night staff with these fabricated complaints." Some of us are trying to enjoy our twilight years in peace. I was startled by her appearance, but even more so by her awareness of Mr. Winter's complaints. How could she have known? "Miss Grayson," I said, stepping forward. "I'm Mars Rajid, the new night security guard. I'm sorry to disturb you, but we're investigating some unusual noises reported in this area." Her pale blue eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "New guard? What happened to Mr. Lopez?" "He left rather suddenly," I explained. "I was hired to replace him." Something like satisfaction flickered across her face. "Did he? How unfortunate." She turned her attention back to Mr. Winters. "As for these noises you keep reporting, I can assure you they're not coming from my apartment. Perhaps if you spent fewer nights drowning your sorrows in bourbon, you wouldn't be imagining things in the small hours." Mr. Winters' face flushed with anger. "I'm not imagining anything, and I'm not the first person to complain about noises from your apartment. What about the tenant before me? Morris? The one who disappeared?" I was surprised he knew about that case, but before I could ask, Miss Grayson's demeanor changed dramatically. Her frail appearance seemed to evaporate as she drew herself up to her full height, still diminutive but somehow commanding. "You would do well not to spread gossip about matters you don't understand, Mr. Winters." Her voice had taken on a steely quality. James Morris was a troubled man who chose to end his life. His disappearance had nothing whatsoever to do with me or this building. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop even further as they stared at each other. I was about to intervene when another sound came from within the wall. This time, unmistakably, a man's voice, though the words were too muffled to make out. Miss Grayson's expression didn't change, but her knuckles whitened around the handle of her cane. "If you'll excuse me," she said coldly, "I need my rest." She turned to re-enter her apartment, then paused to look back at me. "Mr. Reed, I suggest you focus on actual security concerns rather than indulging residents' fantasies. Good night." As her door closed, Mr. Winters turned to me, his expression haunted. "You heard that, right? The voice?" I nodded slowly. "I heard something. But old buildings make all kinds of sounds." "That was a human voice," he insisted, "and she didn't even react to it, like she's used to it." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Look, I'm not crazy. The tenant before me disappeared without a trace. The security guard before you quit suddenly. And now these voices, the cold spots, her appearing out of nowhere when we're talking about her." He lowered his voice. "I think she's hiding someone in there, or something worse." I tried to reassure him that I would investigate further, but he just shook his head and retreated into his apartment. As I continued my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than an elderly resident with noisy pipes or a possible pest infestation. When I returned to my office, I found that the monitor showing the 5th floor hallway had gone dark. According to the system log, it had malfunctioned at exactly 12:17 a.m., precisely when Miss Grayson had opened her door. After my encounter with Miss Grayson, I became obsessed with unraveling the mystery of apartment 512. During my daytime hours, instead of sleeping, I visited the city records office and the historical society, gathering whatever information I could about Grayson Heights and its enigmatic resident. What I discovered disturbed me deeply. Eleanor Grayson had indeed been the daughter of the building's founder, born in 1930. She had lived her entire life in apartment 512, never marrying, never leaving Denver for more than a few days at a time. By all accounts, she had been a fixture of local high society well into the 1970s, hosting elegant soirees and contributing generously to the arts. But there was something else, something mentioned obliquely in a society column from 1952. It referred to Miss Grayson's recovery from her unfortunate incident and her return to seclusion in the family building. I could find no details about what this incident might have been, but it coincided with a 6-month period where her name disappeared entirely from the social pages. More disturbing were the patterns I began to notice when reviewing historical records. Since the building's construction in 1937, 5 residents of apartment 511 had disappeared or died under unclear circumstances. James Morris in 1965 was just one of them. Before him had been an elderly widow who reportedly fell down the stairs in 1954, though her body was found far from any stairwell. After Morris came a young lawyer who disappeared in 1978, his car later found abandoned near the mountains. The most recent had been a graduate student who had lived in 511 for just 3 months in 2014 before being found dead in her bathtub, apparently from an accidental overdose, though friends insisted she had never used drugs. In each case, Eleanor Grayson had been mentioned as a witness or the person who reported the incident. On my 7th night at Grayson Heights, I arrived determined to find concrete answers. The pieces were all there, the hidden shaft, the disappearances, the voices, but I couldn't yet see the full picture they formed. My opportunity came at 2:14 a.m. when the fire alarm on the 5th floor activated. Protocol required me to investigate immediately before calling the fire department to determine if it was a false alarm. When I reached the 5th floor, the hallway was filled with the piercing sound of the alarm. Both Mr. Winters and Miss Tapp Grayson had emerged from their apartments, he in pajamas and a robe, she in another elegant dressing gown, this one a faded blue silk. "What's happening?" Mr. Winters demanded over the noise. "Fire alarm," I shouted back. "Please proceed to the stairwell while I check for signs of an actual fire." Miss Grayson made no move to evacuate. "It's clearly a malfunction," she said dismissively. "This building's wiring is atrocious. I've been complaining about it for decades." "Ma'am, for your safety, please evacuate until we can confirm there's no danger," I insisted. She fixed me with that same intense stare I'd encountered before. "Young man, I am not leaving my home because of a faulty alarm. Now turn that infernal noise off and let me return to bed." Before I could argue further, I noticed something unusual. A thin wisp of smoke emerging not from either apartment, but from a nearly invisible seam in the wall between them. The maintenance shaft. "There might actually be a fire," I said, moving toward the wall. "I need to check the service corridor." Miss Grayson's expression changed instantly from annoyance to alarm. "There is no accessible corridor there. It was sealed decades ago." But I had come prepared. Earlier that day, I had located the original building plans, which showed an access panel hidden behind a decorative wall sconce between the 2 apartments. As I moved toward it, Miss Grayson stepped forward with surprising agility for someone her age. "Stop right there," she commanded. "You have no authority to damage building property." "I'm not damaging anything," I replied, reaching for the sconce. "I'm accessing an existing maintenance shaft to investigate a possible fire. It's part of my job." Mr. Winters had caught on to what I was doing and moved to block Miss Grayson's path, whether intentionally or not. In that moment of distraction, I managed to locate the hidden latch behind the sconce and twist it. With a soft click, a section of the wall, disguised by the same wallpaper as the rest of the hallway, swung inward, revealing a narrow, dark passage. The smoke was definitely coming from inside, along with a smell that wasn't quite like burning wood or electrical components. It was more acrid, more organic. "Miss Grayson, Mr. Winters, please evacuate now," I said firmly, pulling out my flashlight. "I need to check if there's an actual fire." Miss Grayson had gone completely still, her face a mask of cold fury. "You'll regret this interference," she said quietly, barely audible over the alarm. Then, to my surprise, she turned and walked calmly toward the stairwell. Mr. Winters hesitated, clearly torn between curiosity and self-preservation. "Be careful," he finally said, before following Ms. Grayson toward the evacuation route. I took a deep breath and stepped into the hidden corridor. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders, and extended about 15 feet between the two apartments. My flashlight beam revealed decades of dust and cobwebs, but also signs of recent disturbance. Footprints in the dust, scrape marks on the walls. The smoke was coming from farther in, where the corridor widened slightly into a small maintenance hub with access panels to plumbing and electrical systems for both apartments. As I moved forward, the smell grew stronger, like burnt hair and something else I couldn't identify. In the wider section, I found the source of the smoke, a small metal trash can containing smoldering papers. Someone had been burning documents and had either been interrupted or deliberately set off the alarm as a distraction. I quickly extinguished the small fire with a portable extinguisher I carried, then examined what remained of the papers. Most were too charred to read, but a few fragments remained intact. What looked like medical records, with the heading, "Patient James Morris," still visible on one piece. But it wasn't the burning papers that made my blood run cold. It was what I saw when I turned my flashlight toward the back wall of the maintenance hub. A door. A heavy metal door with no handle on this side, only hinges, and what appeared to be a sophisticated electronic lock. A door that, according to the building plans I'd studied, shouldn't exist. It led directly into apartment 512. As I approached it, I noticed something else. Scratch marks on the inside of the door, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. And below them, a small viewing port at eye level, currently closed. With a shaking hand, I slid open the viewing port and shined my light through. What I saw defied explanation. A hospital-style room with modern medical equipment, monitoring devices, and a bed with restraints. The room was empty, but freshly used. The sheets on the bed rumpled, an IV stand still holding a half-empty bag of fluid. My mind raced to process what I was seeing. This wasn't part of the original apartment. It had been built inside it, a hidden room accessible only through this maintenance shaft, completely concealed from anyone who might visit the main apartment legitimately. As I stood there trying to make sense of it all, I heard a sound that made my heart stop. The hidden door to the hallway closing behind me. I spun around to find Miss Grayson standing there, no longer leaning on her cane. In her hand was something small and metallic that I initially mistook for a key fob. "Curiosity is such a problematic trait, Mr. Reed," she said calmly. "It's why I've had to replace so many security guards over the years." "What is this place?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "What have you done?" She smiled, a cold, empty expression. "What have I done? I've survived, Mr. Reed, against all odds, against time itself." She gestured toward the viewing port I'd just looked through. "With a little help, of course. The people who disappeared, Morris, the others, they're part of this, aren't they?" "They contributed to my longevity, yes," she replied with disturbing candor, though most were disappointments. Incompatible. Mr. Morris lasted the longest, nearly 3 years. His heart was exceptional. Horror dawned as I realized what she was implying. "You've been harvesting people?" Such a crude term. I prefer to think of it as selective borrowing. She held up the small metallic object in her hand. "Do you know what this is? It's a remote trigger for a pacemaker. My pacemaker, technically, though the heart it regulates didn't originally belong to me." My mind reeled with the implications, the disappearances spanning decades, the hidden medical room, her impossible longevity. "You won't get away with this," I said, edging toward her, looking for a way to get past her to the exit. "People know I'm in here. Mr. Winters saw me enter." "Mr. Winters will be my next contribution," she said, matter-of-factly. "He's been most troublesome, but his cardiovascular health is excellent. As for you," she pressed a button on the small device in her hand. I expected to feel something, pain perhaps, or some kind of attack, but nothing happened. She frowned, pressing it again. Modern technology, she sighed. So unreliable. That's when I noticed the small electronic jamming device clipped to my belt. Standard issue for security personnel at Grayson Heights, supposedly to prevent remote car break-ins near the building. I'd never given it much thought before, but now I realized it was interfering with whatever signal she was trying to send. In that moment of confusion, I lunged forward, pushing past her toward the exit. She was stronger than she looked, inhumanly strong for someone supposedly in their 90s, but surprise was on my side. I made it to the hidden door and threw it open, tumbling into the hallway where, to my immense relief, stood Mr. Winters alongside 2 police officers. I called them when I saw her follow you in there, he explained, as the officers rushed past me to apprehend Miss Grayson. I've suspected something was wrong for months, but no one would listen. In the days that followed, the full horror of Eleanor Grayson's activities came to light. Behind the walls of apartment 512, authorities discovered a sophisticated medical facility where she had been performing illegal transplant procedures for decades, extending her life well beyond its natural span by harvesting organs from her victims. The maintenance shaft had been her killing ground, a place where she could move between apartments undetected, accessing 5111 to drug its occupants before bringing them back to her hidden operating room. Most disturbing of all were the journals they found, dating back to the 1950s, detailing each procedure in clinical precision. The first had been her own father, who had supposedly died of natural causes in 1952, the same year as her mysterious incident. I left my position at Grayson Heights the day after the discovery. No amount of money was worth the nightmares that followed. The images of that hidden room burned into my memory. Sometimes I still wake in the night, hearing whispering from inside my walls. Logically, I know it's just pipes or settling foundations, the normal sounds of an aging building. But part of me will always wonder if there are other Eleanor Graysons out there, hidden behind respectable facades, with their own secret passages and their own desperate, unnatural hunger for life at any cost. And sometimes in my darkest moments, I wonder if she really acted alone for all those decades, or if the building itself, the very structure of Grayson Heights, was somehow complicit in her monstrous survival. It was Emily's idea to see the midnight showing at the Palace. Not that I needed much convincing. 2 months into our relationship, I would have followed her anywhere. But especially to the Palace, with its faded Art Deco glory and seats that still showed the cigarette burns from an era when smoking indoors was the norm. The Palace Theater stood on the edge of downtown Millbrook, a small city in upstate New York that couldn't decide if it was experiencing a renaissance or continuing a decades-long decline. The theater itself embodied this contradiction. Grand architecture with peeling paint, ornate moldings covered in dust, and a marquee that flickered unevenly against the night sky. "It's showing Vertigo," Emily had said that morning over coffee, her eyes bright with excitement as she scrolled through her phone. Midnight screening? Just one night. They're doing this whole Hitchcock retrospective. She looked up at me, a strand of her dark hair falling across her face. "We have to go, Jake." Emily was a film student at the local university, while I was 3 years out of college and working at an insurance firm, a job that paid the bills but offered little in the way of intellectual stimulation. Emily's passion for cinema was infectious, and I found myself becoming interested in things I'd never cared about before. The way light was used in German expressionist films, the politics behind Italian neorealism, the subtle subversion in certain Hollywood classics. "Midnight on a Tuesday?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Some of us have work tomorrow, Professor." She threw a napkin at me. "Oh, please. You can survive on 5 hours of sleep for one day. This is Hitchcock on the big screen we're talking about. So that's how we ended up pulling into the palace's cracked parking lot at 11:40 p.m. on a Tuesday night in late October, with a thin mist turning the streetlights into hazy orbs. The temperature had dropped since sunset, and Emily huddled against me as we walked from the car, her breath visible in the cold air. "I thought there'd be more people," she said, looking around the empty parking lot. "For Hitchcock." "It's a weeknight," I reminded her. "And Millbrook isn't exactly a hotbed of cinephiles." The lobby was empty, except for a bored teenager at the concession stand, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone. He barely looked up as we purchased our tickets, popcorn, and sodas. "Theater 3, he mumbled, pointing vaguely toward a corridor lined with faded movie posters. "You're the only one so far." Emily squeezed my arm in excitement. Our own private screening, how perfect is that? As we settled into our seats, center row, middle section, Emily's calculated perfect viewing spot, I looked around the cavernous theater. The palace had been built in the 1920s, when movie palaces were designed to make ordinary people feel like royalty for an evening. Despite its worn state, it retained an air of faded elegance, with its high ceiling, ornate wall sconces that cast a warm glow, and heavy velvet curtains framing the screen. "I love that they haven't modernized it too much," Emily whispered, as if we were already watching the film. "You can feel the history." The theater remained empty as the scheduled start time approached. Just as the lights began to dim, I heard the heavy door at the back of the theater open with a distinctive creak. "Not quite a private screening after all," I whispered to Emily, who turned to look over her shoulder. A single figure stood at the entrance, silhouetted against the light from the corridor. A man, tall and thin, wearing what appeared to be an overcoat despite the heated interior. He stood motionless for a moment, surveying the nearly empty theater before making his way down the aisle. With dozens of empty seats available, he chose to sit directly behind us. The previews began to roll, filling the theater with sound and light, but I found myself distracted by the presence behind us. I could hear the subtle movements, the rustle of fabric, the creak of the seat as he shifted his weight. No popcorn sounds, no soda straw noises, none of the normal movie-watching audio footprint. Emily, engrossed in even the previews, didn't seem to notice my discomfort. She leaned forward slightly, her profile illuminated by the screen's glow. Completely captivated, I risked a glance back, turning as if stretching my neck. The stranger was sitting perfectly upright, not slouched like most moviegoers. His features were difficult to make out in the dim light, but I could see he was older, perhaps in his 60s, with a gaunt face and hair combed severely back from his forehead. He wore a suit beneath his overcoat, complete with a tie. Who dresses formally for a midnight movie? He caught me looking and nodded slightly, the gesture neither friendly nor unfriendly, simply acknowledging. I turned back to the screen, feeling oddly unsettled. There was nothing overtly threatening about the man, yet something about his presence, his choice of seat, his formal attire, felt wrong. The feature presentation began, the famous Saul Bass spiral opening credits of Vertigo filling the massive screen. Emily reached for my hand, interlacing her fingers with mine, a habitual gesture whenever we watched something she particularly loved. I tried to focus on the film, on Jimmy Stewart's acrophobia, on Kim Novak's mysterious allure, but my awareness of the man behind us never fully dissipated. About 20 minutes into the film, I felt something. A touch, so light it might have been imagined, at the back of my head, as if someone had very gently brushed my hair with their fingertips. I jerked forward slightly and turned. The stranger was still sitting upright, hands now folded in his lap, eyes on the screen. He didn't acknowledge my movement. "What's wrong?" Emily whispered. "Nothing," I whispered back. thought I felt something. She squeezed my hand and returned her attention to the film. I tried to do the same, but my skin crawled with the sensation of being watched. Not by Hitchcock's camera, but by the eyes I could feel boring into the back of my head. 10 minutes later, Emily excused herself to use the restroom. I watched her walk up the aisle, suddenly anxious about being left alone with the stranger. As soon as the door closed behind her, I heard him shift in his seat. Then his voice, unexpectedly close to my ear. "She reminds me of my Madeline," he said, his voice a dry whisper. I turned, startled by both his proximity. He had leaned forward so that his face was just inches from mine, and his words. Madeline was the name of Kim Novak's character in the film. "Excuse me?" I managed. His face, now visible in the light reflected from the screen, was deeply lined, the skin stretched taut over prominent cheekbones. His eyes were a pale color I couldn't define in the dim light. "My Madeline," he repeated, then gestured toward the screen. "She fell too. They all fall eventually." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the theater's air conditioning. The man's expression remained placid, almost pleasant, as if he were discussing the weather rather than making cryptic, vaguely threatening remarks. Before I could respond, the door opened again, and Emily returned. The stranger settled back into his seat as if nothing had happened. "Did I miss anything important?" Emily whispered as she sat down. "No," I said, unable to take my eyes off the screen, where Jimmy Stewart was following Kim Novak's character through the streets of San Francisco. "Nothing important." As the film continued, so did the strange behavior of our fellow moviegoer. It was subtle at first, a soft humming during scenes with no dialogue, a whispered word or two that I couldn't quite make out. Then it escalated. During the scene where Scotty follows Madeline to the museum, where she sits staring at a portrait of a woman who died long ago, I heard the stranger begin to whisper more insistently. This time, I could make out what he was saying. "That's not right. That's not how it happened. She didn't sit like that. She stood. She always stood." Emily shot me a questioning look. I shrugged, trying to convey that I was as confused as she was. The whispering continued, growing slightly louder, though still only audible to us due to our proximity. The hair was wrong too. Not blonde. Never blonde. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, debating whether to confront him or move to different seats. Before I could decide, the stranger fell silent again as the scene changed. During the famous nightmare sequence, with its disorienting spiral motifs and flashes of color, I felt something brush against the back of my neck again, more definitively this time. I whipped around. "Do you mind?" I hissed. The stranger stared back at me, his expression unchanged. "She's in danger," he said calmly. "You're Madeline, just like mine was." Emily turned now too. "Is everything okay?" she asked, looking between us. "Your boyfriend doesn't like me," the stranger said, addressing Emily directly for the first time. His voice had changed, become almost charming. "I can't blame him. I wouldn't like me either in his position." Emily, ever the diplomat, offered a small smile. "We're just trying to watch the movie." "Of course," the man nodded. "It's a fascinating film. So many parallels." He gestured vaguely between Emily and me, history repeating itself. "Right?" I said, turning back to the screen and pulling Emily's hand into mine. "Let's just watch the film." For the next half hour, the stranger remained silent. I began to relax slightly, allowing myself to be drawn back into Hitchcock's twisted tale of obsession and identity. On screen, Scotty was transforming Judy back into the image of Madeline, forcing her to change her clothes, her hair, her very self. Then I felt it again. Not a touch this time, but breath on my neck. Warm, moist air that indicated the stranger had leaned forward, his mouth inches from my skin. I froze. "I tried to save my Madeline," he whispered, his voice so low I could barely hear it over the film's soundtrack. "I followed her everywhere, watched her, but in the end, she fell anyway. They always fall." I stood up abruptly, pulling Emily with me. "We're moving," I said, loud enough that my voice echoed slightly in the near-empty theater. I guided Emily to seats several rows away, ignoring her confused protests. "Jake, what the hell?" she demanded once we were resettled. "That guy is seriously creeping me out," I said. "He keeps whispering weird stuff about the movie, about his Madeline falling, and about me," Emily finished, her expression changing from annoyance to concern. "You think he was threatening me?" I don't know what he was doing, but I didn't like it. We both glanced back at the stranger, who hadn't moved from his original seat. In the flickering light from the screen, I could see that he was staring directly at us, not at the movie at all. And he was smiling. The climactic scenes of Vertigo played out on screen. Judy's confession, Scotty's realization of the truth, the final tragic climb up the bell tower. But neither Emily nor I was fully engaged anymore. We were both acutely aware of the stranger, who remained in his seat, but whose attention seemed fixed entirely on us, rather than the film. "Maybe we should just go," Emily whispered, her earlier enthusiasm for the screening clearly diminished. I checked my watch. The film had less than 15 minutes left. "We've come this far," I said. "Let's just see it through." But even as I said it, I saw the stranger rise from his seat. Instead of heading toward the exit, he moved to the aisle beside our new seats and sat down again, just a few spots away from us. Close enough that I could see him clearly now in the light from the climactic scene. His suit was outdated, the kind of sharply tailored style popular in the late 1950s, the same era as the film we were watching. His overcoat was draped over his arm now, revealing a suit jacket with wide lapels. His tie was narrow, his collar high, and on his left hand he wore a signet ring that caught the light from the screen. "Beautiful, isn't she?" he said, not bothering to whisper now, gesturing toward Emily, but looking at me. "You're Madeline." "My name is Emily," she said firmly, finding her voice. "And we're trying to watch the movie." The stranger tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made me shift my position slightly, ready to intervene if necessary. "Names change," he said. "Faces change. The story remains the same." On screen, Judy and Scotty were ascending the Mission Bell Tower, the scene building toward its tragic conclusion. "What do you want?" I asked directly, keeping my voice low but making no effort to hide my irritation. The stranger smiled, a thin, humorless stretching of lips. "To warn you," he said simply. "I've seen this before, many times." He gestured toward the screen, where Jimmy Stewart's character was forcing Kim Novak's up the spiral staircase. The obsession, the fall. I've lived it. "Look, I think you should leave us alone," I said, my voice firmer now. "Jake," Emily put her hand on my arm, a cautionary gesture. "You think you know her," the stranger continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "But do you? Does anyone ever truly know another person?" He leaned forward, addressing Emily directly now. "Has he started selecting your clothes yet? Telling you how to wear your hair? Molding you into his ideal?" "That's enough," I said, standing up. "Either move to another seat, or I'm getting the manager." The stranger remained seated, looking up at me with those pale, unblinking eyes. "There's always a fall," he said calmly. "I'm just trying to help you avoid mine." "We don't need your help," I said. "Jake, let's just go." Emily tugged at my sleeve. "The movie's almost over anyway." I hesitated, torn between not wanting to be chased away and increasingly concerned about the stranger's fixation. On screen, the final tragic scene was playing out. Judy's fall from the bell tower, Scotty's horrified reaction, the abrupt and unsettling end to Hitchcock's masterpiece. As the credits began to roll, the lights in the theater gradually brightened. The stranger stood, towering over us both. In the increased light, I could see his face more clearly. The deep-set eyes that I now realized were a pale, almost colorless blue. The gaunt cheeks, the shock of silver hair combed severely back from his high forehead. "My Madeline's name was Eleanor," he said, putting on his overcoat with deliberate movements. She died 63 years ago. Fell from the balcony of our apartment, or jumped, or was pushed. The police were never quite sure. He smoothed the lapels of his coat. I see her everywhere still. In every dark-haired woman, in every relationship poisoned by possessiveness. Emily stood now too, her face pale. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, her voice gentle despite the strangeness of the situation. "But we're not characters in a movie or in your past. We're just two people who came to see a film." The stranger studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly, as if coming to some private conclusion. "Perhaps you're right," he said. Then he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something small that he placed on the armrest of the seat beside him. "A token of my apology for disturbing your evening." Before either of us could respond, he turned and walked up the aisle toward the exit, his gait stiff but purposeful. The heavy door creaked open, then shut behind him. In the fully restored light of the theater, I approached the item he had left, a small photograph. Its edges yellowed with age. It showed a young woman with dark hair styled in a way popular in the late 1950s, smiling at the camera. She was standing on what appeared to be a balcony, her hands resting on a railing, a city skyline visible behind her. "She looks like you," I said to Emily, who had come to stand beside me. "A little," she admitted, taking the photo from my hands and examining it. Then she turned it over. On the back, in faded blue ink, someone had written, "Eleanor at the Palmer House, Chicago, September 1958, 2 weeks before." We looked at each other, the same chill running through us both. The teenager from the concession stand was sweeping the lobby when we emerged from the theater, the only sign that the palace was closing for the night. The mist outside had thickened into a light rain, visible in the cone of light beneath the street lamps. "Did you see an older man leave just now?" I asked him. Tall, thin, wearing an old-fashioned suit and overcoat. The teen looked up from his sweeping, confusion evident on his face. "No one's come out since you two went in," he said. "You were the only customers for the midnight show." Emily and I exchanged glances. "That's not possible," she said. "There was another man in the theater with us. He just left a few minutes ago." The teen shrugged. "I've been here the whole time, except for a bathroom break. No one else came in or out." He looked at his watch. "We're closed now, so..." Outside in the parking lot, our car sat alone under the flickering light of a street lamp. No other vehicles were visible. "Maybe he parked somewhere else," Emily suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Or took a taxi. In Millbrook at 2 a.m.? I shook my head. The smallest mystery, where the stranger had come from and how he had left, seemed safer to focus on than the larger, more disturbing questions his presence had raised. The drive back to Emily's apartment was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. The photograph lay between us on the console, neither of us quite wanting to touch it again. "Do you think he was just some film buff who gets too into character?" Emily finally asked as we pulled into her complex. "Like, he dresses up as characters from old movies and creeps people out at screenings?" I wanted to agree with her, to find some rational explanation that would let us laugh off the encounter. But the image of those pale eyes, the absolute conviction in his voice when he spoke of his Madeline, the uncanny resemblance between Emily and the woman in the photograph, it all felt too deliberate, too specific to be a random encounter with an eccentric cinephile. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm not in a hurry to go back to the palace anytime soon." Emily was quiet for a moment, then said, "The thing that bothers me most is what he said about you, about whether you were trying to change me, mold me into someone else." She turned to look at me directly. "You're not, are you?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course not," I said immediately. "I love you exactly as you are." But even as I said it, small doubts crept in. Hadn't I just last week mentioned that I preferred her hair down rather than up? Hadn't I bought her a blue dress for her birthday because I thought it would suit her, even though she rarely wore dresses? Were these the innocent preferences and gifts of a caring boyfriend, or the first steps down a path of trying to reshape someone into an ideal? I hope so, Emily said softly, because what scared me wasn't just him. It was the idea that the line between love and obsession might be thinner than we think. In the weeks that followed, we never spoke directly about the stranger again, though I often caught Emily studying me when she thought I wasn't looking, as if searching for signs of Scotty's possessiveness in my behavior. I found myself second-guessing every comment I made about her appearance, every suggestion about our shared time. We researched Eleanor Palmer House, Chicago, 1958, online, but found nothing conclusive. Just fragments that could support or contradict the stranger's story. A society page mention of an Eleanor and James Thornton attending a charity gala at the Palmer House Hotel in August 1958. A small newspaper item about a woman falling from an apartment balcony in Chicago in October of that year, with no names mentioned. The photograph disappeared from Emily's coffee table where she had left it, neither of us willing to admit we had hidden it away or thrown it out. Our relationship continued, but it was altered, not dramatically, but in subtle ways. A new self-consciousness had crept in, an awareness of how easily love could tip into something darker. Sometimes, catching our reflection in a window or mirror, I would see not us, but the ghostly outline of Scotty and Madeline, locked in their doomed spiral. 3 months later, we returned to the palace. Not for a midnight showing this time, but for a Sunday afternoon screening of Rear Window, another Hitchcock classic. Emily suggested it and I agreed, both of us silently acknowledging that we needed to reclaim the space, to prove to ourselves that our experience had been an anomaly. The theater was busier this time, a scattered audience of about 20 people enjoying the weekend matinee. We chose seats in the middle, surrounded by other viewers, safely anonymous in the crowd. As the lights dimmed and the previews began, I felt Emily tense beside me. I followed her gaze to the entrance of the theater, where a figure stood silhouetted against the light from the corridor. For a moment, my heart seemed to stop. Then the figure moved down the aisle, revealing itself to be a middle-aged woman searching for her seat. Emily let out a small, nervous laugh and squeezed my hand. "Sorry," she whispered. "I guess I'm still a little jumpy." I nodded, understanding completely. We both turned our attention to the screen, where Jimmy Stewart's character was using his binoculars to spy on his neighbors, unaware that his obsessive watching would soon lead him into danger. Halfway through the film, during a quiet scene, I became aware of a presence in the row directly behind us. Not directly behind, that would be too obvious, too deliberate a repetition, but offset by 2 seats. I told myself not to turn around, that it was just another moviegoer who had arrived late or changed seats for a better view. But then I caught a scent, faint but distinctive, of an old-fashioned cologne, the kind that hadn't been popular for decades. And I heard a whisper, so soft it might have been imagined. It always begins the same way. Watching, always watching. I turned, already knowing who I would see. The same gaunt face, the same pale eyes, the same formal attire from another era. He nodded at me in recognition, then shifted his gaze to Emily, who was still absorbed in the film, unaware of our spectral companion's return. "Some stories never end," he whispered, his eyes never leaving Emily. "They just find new players." As I opened my mouth to respond, to confront him, to demand answers, a shaft of light from the projector passed directly over him. For the briefest moment, his features seemed to shift, to become transparent, revealing another face beneath, younger but with the same pale eyes, the same intensity of focus. Then the light moved on, and he was just an old man again, watching us with a mixture of pity and fascination. "Be careful how closely you watch her," he said, his voice still low enough that only I could hear. "And be more careful still of what you choose to see." On screen, Jimmy Stewart's character was realizing the danger his obsessive surveillance had placed him in. In the darkened theater, surrounded by strangers, I realized that our own story had no clear ending, that we were caught in a loop as old as desire itself, where love and obsession danced together on the edge of a precipice. The stranger leaned back in his seat, his attention apparently returning to the film. But I felt his presence like a weight, a reminder of paths that lay ahead and choices not yet made. Emily, sensing my distraction, turned to me with a questioning look. I smiled reassuringly and took her hand, focusing on its warmth, its reality. Behind us, the stranger watched. And somewhere in the space between fiction and reality, between past and present, another story, our story, continued to unfold, frame by frame, with no one certain how it would end.